It's the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 13, The W.A.R. Comp. I'm Mark Rudolph.
And I'm Jason Hundy. So this time, kind of like Repulsion, which we did a few weeks back, we decided to just focus on one album. And I know this is was a life-changing album for me based on where I was at because of my age. I was still in high school when this record came out, and I'm sure for you it was...
this was kind of, for everybody that was involved in the magazine at the time, this was like the equivalent of the Metal Massacre records in the early 80s that kind of brought out, I don't know if Venom was on those or not, but Metallica and a lot of other bands
Slayer
really kind of pushed them to Hellhammer and this just seemed like the modern equivalent of that. It was like the holy crap record. Like everything you heard on it was like, oh my god, all these bands are great, and you can't find any of this. It was all exclusive content too.
Except for the Miscreant tune was the only thing that had been had been released.
Yeah, and this stuff that was released was re-recorded for this record, or a different version of it, or something like that. But
and this is really sort of the validation, almost the nucleus or starting point for what would become kind of the Gothenburg sound.
Yeah,
I mean, there had been prior to this, Eucharist had put out Velvet Creation, and in
that was
Flames,
actually the first. That was Wrong Again Records #1.
Yeah, which is where the W.A.R. comes from in the W.A.R. comp. It's W.A.R. And then In Flames had put out Lunar Strain. Miscreant had put out their record, and so those were really the only things that W.A.R. had put out prior to this.
Yeah,
and it was sort of an emerging new label, and it obviously as years kind of progress, it becomes a pretty big record. And nowadays it's called Regain Records, I think.
It went from a Wrong Again to W.A.R. to like New Holland to Regain.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who stayed with each one, but that's kind of been the genesis of the
and I think
of the label.
I think Nagelfar was on there for quite a while.
They're on there for 2 records, or they're on there for 1 record on Wrong Again, and then their second one, I can't even think of what that one's called now. Diabolical. That was on W.A.R.
Yeah.
And then after Wrong Again, the W.A.R. did their own thing called the W.A.R. Dance, which is similar.
They had like Darkane and Carnal Forge and Cryptopsy, Armageddon. Chris Amott's side project was on there.
Arch Enemy pretty solid. The first Arch Enemy record was on Wrong Again as well. Yep. So and it was a really prolific label, and it almost had that like feel of like a 60s jazz label that just had all this like emerging like powerful stuff right on there. Sure. It's just like wow. Just
like like Impulse was in the 60s for jazz, or really comparable to I think maybe the early years of Earache, when it was Altars of Madness, and then Street Cleaner, and then Left Hand Path, and it was just like one thing after another. And there are a few kind of off records that are in there,
like old or
but for the most part, it really was this sort of huge explosion of a whole scene that kind of happened around this label.
It seemed like the most niche label out of any. I mean, there was like Head Not Found and a couple other like weird record labels like that too.
Spine Farm almost kind of had its own sort of Finnish sound that was going for a while, where you could almost buy anything that was on Spine Farm or Spike Farm, as it's kind of called today. But
they had Dark Tranquility on there, and Immortal. I mean, it was kind of an oddball label too. But
so all these
to be like, this was almost like, it seemed like confined to more of like a geological region than any other, or geological region. Yeah, they're all inside of a cave. Geographic region outside of. I think everybody was from pretty much that same area.
I think so. I'm not terribly sure about where the roots of Katatonia and Dissection are. I mean, I feel like they were neither Stockholm nor Gothenburg, but they kind of.
But everybody's Swedish.
Yeah, everybody's Swedish. That's for sure.
It's like a Michigan label, if you know something.
But this was really the coalescence of the whole Swedish melodic death metal, black metal sort of scene kind of happened on this record. I think if you had been paying attention at the time, you could start to sense that something was amiss. That that you had the Stockholm sound, which was going with Dismember and Unleashed and Entombed, and this really sort of bass, thick, heavy kind of sound. And they had some really kind of single picking melodic leads, kind of via Iron Maiden, that were starting to come through. But then, out of the ashes, you had out of the ashes of Grotesque, you had At the Gates formulate in the early 90s, and then Eucharist had put out Velvet Creation, and then In Flames had done Lunar Strain, and Dark Tranquility had done Sky Dancer.
Yeah.
But it was almost like all these like threads were sort of floating out there, and it took the war comp to grab all those threads and say, listen folks, this is a scene, pay attention. Like
it seems like this was like the Entombed era, 89, 90 era. That was like the primordial or the primordial version of all this stuff, like where the idea first got out, and this was like the second refinement, I think.
Yeah, it's like the second wave of Swedish metal.
It's like, okay, let's take all this aggression and this style, but let's really add some melody to it, like totally amp it up.
Sure.
And add like stuff that In Flames was doing with classical guitars, stuff in Dark Tranquility was doing with different kinds of vocal patterns. And
you had on Skydancer, which we could do a whole episode on that record alone. I'm sure you had female vocals that were kind of entering the fold, which Paradise Lost, a previous couple episodes back, we had kind of experimented with them. You had acoustic guitars, a lot of acoustic interludes,
a lot of folk elements.
Folk music I think is a really big component of this scene. Just like I think folk music really had an impact on some of the Finnish scene with Amorphous and Sentence and some of that. It was also really taking its roots here, and you don't hear any folk elements in anything that Dismember and Tomb. Those guys were all straightforward death metal.
Oh, sure.
The only thing you would hear in there is like garage rock and sort of the Stooges MC5 sort of influence
the
that would
bombastic
pervade.
loudness,
And this was a totally different sort of thing that was happening, and other bands that weren't really melodic death metal per se, like Katatonia or Dissection, but whereas Dissection was black metal, they weren't like Mayhem, they weren't Emperor.
They had heavy thrash elements thrown into them, and a lot of like just beautiful melodies throughout that stuff. The Black Death title, as they were.
A lot of classical guitar playing. I remember like Feathers Fell and some of those sort of interlude kind of things that were on some of their early records, Somberlane and Storm of Light's Bane. Another
interesting thing about this record is there's so many cross-pollination of members and bands, it's almost impossible to keep it all straight, but between In Flames and Dark Tranquility, Ceremonial Oath, there's just a mishmash of members. Like it's hard to tell what's what.
It's like hey, get your notes out, folks, because we're gonna.
And even with like Dissection, you had John Svetlut left, and he formed Cardinal Sin, and that had people from this band. And I mean, if you drew a family tree on a wall, it'd be the biggest mess in the world.
Which we attempted one time when we were doing Eclipse.
I started back with this was all the Stockholm scene stuff. I was trying to plot one out for that. And, I wish I knew where it was, but
it was pretty phenomenal.
Yes, pretty unreal trying to track all that stuff down.
To give those of you listening kind of just a sort of a perspective on all this, imagine for a second that In Flames' original vocalist was Michael Stani, who then went on after the first two In Flames. He left after the first In Flames after
became bass player of Dark Tranquility.
Bass player and vocalist. No, he became the vocalist. Stani did.
For Skydancer?
No. Anders Frieden was the vocalist on Skydancer from Dark Tranquility. And
Stani did some clean vocals on that record.
Yes, and then Frieden left and became the vocalist for In Flames.
Yep.
And Ceremonial Oath he was doing at the time, which we'll be hearing on this War Comp as well. And then Michael Stani, who had quit In Flames, came over and sang now permanently for Dark Tranquility. I mean, that's just one of a million different combinations we can sort of throw together here, folks. So it's a very incestuous, strange sort of scene, and that's partially, I think, why the War Comp was needed to really give it an identity to this whole scene in a way. So. But it's also very highly sought after. It's one of the rare.
I'm surprised that it's I've known people that have had it stolen from them.
Yes,
people that have passed it over and regretted it. But I keep mine in pristine shape in a little plastic bag in a safe under my bed. But
it's that was the other thing about Wrong Again Records is it was such a quality label that. But they didn't print a lot out. I know the first run of the first Arch Enemy is pretty hard to get. Velvet Creation from Eucharist is really hard.
Arch Enemy is impossible except for the reissue.
But. Lunar Strain and Subterranean, the first full length and EP from In Flames are pretty hard to get a hold of the originals. And I know I've been tempted to sell those on eBay before and
hundreds of dollars for one CD. I mean, it's kind of unreal.
Yeah, so that's again this allure in like you mentioned before, giving it sort of almost a collector's jazz band kind of quality. That there's a rarity to this record label of Wrong Again Records.
Well, and all the artwork across the board was it had all this like Hasenblad done photography by what was his name? Something Johansson, I forget. But he did a lot of the photography and the layout and everything. Just had this great cohesiveness to it and just unbelievable like quality on every level.
I was gonna say, whenever I bought a record on this label, it felt not cheaply put together. It felt like it had an air of quality to it, and almost in the same way that Peaceville did it in a certain sense, where you knew you were buying something kind of special. But it's just sort of interesting. I myself don't have an original copy of this. I was one of those people who stared at it for years at that record store, and I remember thinking, oh, it's just a compilation. It's no big deal. I'll get all this stuff on other records. And those Eucharist songs never really showed up anywhere else. These versions of Katatonia never really showed up anywhere else until a couple of years ago. Ceremonial Oath, it was tough to track down their record, Carpet, which luckily I have. But
that was put on a Black Sun, and I can't imagine it had more than 3,000 press. It's definitely kind of hard to find now.
And even Dissection, luckily Dissection was able to put those tunes out on the Where Dead Angels Lie EP, and then later they've shown up on some of the reissues as well.
Yeah, The End actually put out 2 really great versions of Somberlane and Storm of the Lightsbane. That has every possible conceivable version of everything.
Of every song, that they've ever recorded. But so again, there's a mystique to this, not just because of the music on it, which the music is of the utmost quality for sure. But there's also this mystique of making it a rare gem. Who in their right mind in 1994, 95, when this record came out, would have the foresight to bring Dark Tranquility, In Flames, Katatonia, Dissection, together into one sort of. And at the time, I'm sure, looking back in that era, most people would have flipped past this and gone, who the hell are these bands?
Yeah, really.
And that's sort of a strange quality to it, much like the Metal Massacre comps that Mark was speaking about earlier. Who in the hell's Metallica? Never heard of them.
This kind of came out at a time when Nuclear Blast was floundering a little bit. Everybody was either you had a glut of bands, but you had basically Relapse, Nuclear Blast, Century Media, Earache, Roadrunner, and Metal Blade.
Yep.
And this was yet another label to pop out with all these other Swedish labels, with talked about Black Sun, Had Not Found, Plastic had distributed a bunch of weird stuff.
Yep.
But this just seemed like another label, so no, I don't think anybody really paid much attention to it until this thing kind of holy crap, look at the lineups they have.
Yeah. And then you once you hear a lot of these songs that we're going to play for you this week, I think you'll know why just the utmost quality and some of the best melodic Swedish metal you're ever going to hear. So
this is all at the kind of the early stages of all these guys' careers, with the exception of Dissection and Katatonia. These are second, third albums. Same with Dark Tranquility, but for Eucharist and what else we have here?
In Flames.
It's all within their first couple of albums.
Sure.
So it's the genesis of all this
I think almost all the bands had recorded maybe one record, and this was almost right before each band's really second record, because Katatonia had just done only one full length, Dance of December Souls. Dissection had only done The Somber Lane. In Flames had just done Lunar Strain. Dark Tranquility
did Book of Truth.
Dark Tranquility had just done Sky Dancer. Eucharist had just done Velvet Creation. So
it's just kind of amazing, this kind of that amount of talent, and how much quality was there with all these bands almost at the same kind of artistic level too. It was just it's unbelievable.
Yeah, it wouldn't have surprised me if a song, a throwaway song at the very end would have been a early demo version of Opeth Orchid or something. I mean, it almost would have fit perfectly with the theme of what this whole record was all about.
Well, at this area it was really easy to get kind of just dismiss a lot of bands too, Crystal Age, for instance, that had Oscar, what was his last name?
John Zach or something. Yeah,
everybody knows him from Hammerfall. Guitarist from Hammerfall, the incredibly thin guy that wears armor. But there's that Crystal Age record that I've bought it, I've sold it, I've listened to it 3 or 4 times throughout the years, and finally, this year, I was man, they were really onto something here. It's just this really kind of chaotic thing, but during that era, there's a bunch of bands like that I think it was too much at the time to actually absorb it. So a lot of them just got kind of, I think, broke up and then ended up all the best members kind of formed bands on their own, and
Liars and Ways, Sacrilege, even Ceremonial Oath, which has contributed 2 songs to this comp, they were sort of looked over as well. I mean,
and now
people are kind of they're just a dirty In Flames, they don't really have much going for them.
You look at a lot of these going back and seeing the current incarnations of In Flames. You've got Anders Frieden, original vocalist on Ceremonial Oath, and I can't think of his first name. Yeah, Iwers, the
Anders Ayers.
Yeah, the current bass player in Flames is originally from Ceremonial Oath, and probably a bunch of other things as well. But it's quite an incestuous line when you go back and look at it.
Yeah. But speaking of In Flames, that's what we're gonna get things kind of kicking off with. is one of my favorite tunes of theirs, and this will eventually show up on the Subterranean EP, which for my money, and this is just one man's opinion, of course, my money, the Subterranean EP is probably the most solid 5 songs that they've sort of ever put down, like in a singular vision. And interestingly enough, Stani isn't singing for him on this one, and neither is Anders yet. Anders is still singing with Ceremonial Oath, but there's a guy by the name of Hense Forrest or something, I think is how you pronounce. I'll probably butcher his last name. I'm sorry, I'm not a Swedish or Norwegian expert, but he sings for Dawn, which is kind of near and dear to my heart.
They're kind of in the Dissection school to some degree.
Yeah, and so it gives it like a harsher feel than what maybe some of you guys are used to with the In Flames kind of sound. And then we're going to kind of go into their compatriots song Punish My Heaven, which is a sort of a standard tune for Dark Tranquility, and end things with a Miscreant song called Forever Not to Be, and we'll talk more about those when we come back. So enjoy Ever Dying from In Flames from the W.A.R. comp.
Crying
You just heard Miscreant, Forever Not to Be. Before that, Punish My Heaven from Dark Tranquility, and Ever Dying from In Flames got us rolling. And Punish My Heaven, I know, we were joking about earlier, is a song. Yeah, we've heard it so many times because it's the song. It was like a big deal attraction on this record, and also was the opener to The Gallery, which was Dark Tranquility's.
And it was on a handful of other things too. That I just at the time it was just a glut. Like people back in the day listened to that song a lot more than others, and I just kind of tuned that one out of my mind altogether at this point.
But it is a quality.
It's a great song, but it's just I've heard it so much I don't need to hear it anymore.
Yeah, but we figured you, the listening audience, maybe don't have that kind of experience with Punish My Heaven that maybe we did, but. Again, it's a formulation of all these bands' sort of sound, and it really sort of gives, I think, a direction of where Dark Tranquility, excuse me, a little mouthful there.
Really tightened them up, I think.
Sure.
Kind of put them on track instead of being like this big. I mean, Skydancer is like he was like magnum opus for first record.
Wow, it was all over the place. After that? I know, it was all over the place. And Miscreant, I don't know as much about them, and they're kind of a mystery.
Yeah, I mean, we couldn't really find a whole heck of a lot on them, and.
They only have one record that they put out, which is where this Forever Not to Be song kind of came from. But
didn't we find like a lot of them went on to do some power metal band or something?
Yeah, someone went on to do power metal. One of the guys vocally ended up in, I can't for the life of me remember what it was called, but again, it's just sort of a strange mythos to that record. And that tune, kind of an epic, longer tune, kind of some keyboards working in there, which was sort of new to that scene. I think the keyboards.
Out of the first set, they were, I think, the most kind of stripped down out of everybody. It seemed like they were trying to go a lot of places, but as far it wasn't quite as vibrant as the other songs.
I don't know if they ever really found their sound, and that's probably why they ultimately kind of parted ways. So, but Ever Dying, it should just be worth noting the part at the end with the folk acoustic guitar stuff is just they had sort of introduced that with Behind Space on Lunar Strain, and then the Horglaten, or it's the Swedish folk song.
You can be the butcher of
Harglaten, maybe. I don't even have Lunar Strain in front of me, unfortunately, but anyways, they had gone into this sort of folk sort of element, a lot of like old, like late 60s, early 70s kind of folk rock,
even more traditional, like to their country kind of stuff.
Sure. Well, Kev Nikazi had done the original of it, which was unique for In Flames to have done like a cover of an obscure band like Kev Nikazi with Kenny Hawkinson, who later played with Bo Hansen, for those of you Prague fans out there.
Bo Hansen, Magician's Hat, buddy.
Yeah, exactly. And but I felt like this was maybe their best attempt at that type of sound of linking the folk elements at the end with with their metal roots and Ever Dying.
I think a lot of the stuff actually you start hearing a little bit, at least in like Ceremonial Oath, a little bit in Dark Tranquility, and In Flames. You hear a little bit of that Metallica era thrash, Exodus thrash chunk kind of in the background. The melody of that and the heaviness of that, just some of the different kind of approaches to songwriting they took, but then they add that single string high speed picking kind of deal to it, and it really kind of amps it up.
And I think it should be noted as well that the German thrash scene, if we didn't mention it before, was a huge component to this, with Creator, Destruction, Sodom, really adding that sort of layer, that element of extra step of heaviness that some of the American thrash didn't have at times. So yeah, without a doubt. The next stuff we're going to play it's probably my favorite stuff on the whole record, even though they're not my favorite band on the record. Probably Katatonia would have to be up there for me, or maybe even Dissection or Tranquility. But Eucharist is such a fascinatingly weird band, because you hear the quality of their work at times, and you wonder, why didn't they go that next step that Dark Tranquility and Flames at the Gates, that their colleagues went. And
I think they were the youngest out of the group too. I mean, they were like 14, 15 when they recorded this record. They look like they're right up the school bus on the back cover of the album. But
I think that maybe lended a level of maturity, which I know when you hear some bands talk about, they're not able to at a young age deal with sort of band problems. certainly Metallica, when they talk about their issues with Dave Mustaine, have said, if we were 10 years older, we would have handled that whole situation differently. We probably would try to get him help or figure things out. But at the time, we were like, we don't want to put up with this. You're out of the band. And so I don't know if that was what was going on. I also think that the vocalist for Eucharist had a very distinct vocal style that was a little bit more over the top than what you heard.
I really liked it.
Oh, I liked it
and
too.
And he went on to front the, what was it called?
Cromlech, yep. And it's certainly a cool extreme sound, but I think for some people they were looking
it could be off-putting, I think.
Yeah, I think they were looking for the more melodic tones that you got.
And it was slightly monotonous.
Yeah.
He didn't have a ton of range, so he had to really formulate his vocal lines right, otherwise it'd just be like, ugh.
Yep.
Kind of like the first Nagelfar record, Vitra. Some people just cannot get into that because the vocals are so high and screechy and kind of monotonous,
And I think, they were a band that walked that sort of lonely path for a long time.
Yeah.
Like Eucharist did. They really didn't get any attention.
Yeah, and they kind of luckily hung on long enough to have Sheol and last couple of records really kind of, in Pride
and Harvest
get going for them, yeah.
And but the thing about Eucharist is that the sum of their parts has sort of, went on and done some more interesting stuff. I think Eucharist early on were known for their age, but also their rhythm section. I mean, the bass playing that you're going to hear on Wounded and Alone and Predictable End is amongst some of the better, more progressive, sort of listenable bass playing that you hear of this whole scene, I think. And the other thing you hear is Daniel Erslandison, the brother of At the Gates drummer Adrian Erslandison, who now plays for Cradle of Filth,
Daniel plays for
Arch Enemy now. But so like I said, you got your notepad out when you're listening to this thing because you need to draw some lines, and it's like reading Lord of the Rings or something. You got to make kind of flow charts and stuff. Yeah. But Daniel, I remember hearing on that death metal comp, The View, that tune, and his drums are just absolutely incredible, and that's another great compilation as well.
That's one I don't have.
At the Gates and Dissection are on that one, but we won't get over compilation-y on you here. But you can really sort of hear the tastefulness of the rhythm section, I think, on these two tunes, and of course the melodies and the single string picking are just absolutely infectious.
Yeah, the way they take a lot of the stuff that Entombed and Dismember and Carnage and those bands are doing to the extremity, and actually injecting that bit of harmony, but also the arrangements are like really classically done, like really like it seems like almost like too wise for their years kind of stuff.
And on these were recorded right after Velvet Creation, their debut, and then the next record, their kind of final release, really is called Mirror Worlds, and that even included a song with an oboe player that's very abstract.
Yeah.
Again, I think you're right. Maybe they were too wise for their years. I think they're doing this sort of stuff.
They're a bunch of like classic, or they spent their entire childhood. I don't have. This is just all here, or conjecture, but they spent their entire childhoods like listening or being trained classically for, piano and saxophone, things like that, and then all of a sudden, teenage years hit and death metal gene starts to kick in, and then
somebody
all of a sudden
tossed an Entombed record their way, and we want to do this. But you're right. There's a virtuosity to these guys that's I think you don't hear in some of the other bands. And I think I almost hear some of the stuff that Eucharist does in what Opeth's doing today. But again, they were 10 years ahead of their time in some ways. Using the oboe, just using those sort of different atmospheres, sort of, just crazy arrangements. Like you said, more of a classical approach to metal in a way. And I think you'll hear that on these two tunes. And Wounded and Alone, for my money, is probably my favorite Eucharist song across the board. Predictable End is up there as well, which is really triumphant, almost happy. And that's one of the things
they got one of the most bizarre guitar tones. I don't even know how to describe it, but after you listen to all these other bands, they're definitely going to pop out as having this. I don't even know how to. I mean, it's just a really
more
odd
beat or something.
Yeah, it's like almost like a major chord, but then it's slightly like muted and rounded sound. It's really it just sounds really like off.
Yeah, it's like an offbeat, like triumphant song. It's like triumphant, but yet there's something like uncomfortable about it.
But there's like triumphant wrapped with a little bit of melancholy hanging on the end.
Yeah,
it's just really it's
$5.99.
Especially if you hear Velvet Creation, that's got one of the most bizarre recordings and mixing. And
Mirror Worlds is weird as well. That oboe tune on Mirror Worlds.
Everything sounds kind of condensed.
In Nakedness, too. I think it was called. But yeah, it's just a bizarre.
Yeah, really interesting band though.
And then we'll end this set with a Ceremonial tune, which we'll talk a lot more about who those guys are when we come back. So enjoy a pairing of Eucharist off the War Comp. heard The Shadowed End from Ceremonial Oath off of the W.A.R. compilation, which is our feature this evening. Before that, a pairing of Eucharist songs, not the Catholic holiday or Eastern Orthodox holiday, excuse me, but
the Eucharist is actually the body of Christ in the Catholic religion.
This is true.
I grew up with this.
Yeah. So predictable end.
It's not the Salty Wafer. It's a great band.
Yeah. Well, they could be salty too. I don't know, but it's Ceremonial Oath is a band you have a little bit more experience with, I guess, because you have most of their back catalog. I've only got
they've only got the 2 records of Book of Truth, which is a little bit more straight ahead. I think Oscar from Hammerfall and Crystal Age is doing vocals on that first one, but that's just kind of straight ahead stuff. This Carpet is a really interesting record. That's, I mean, just imagery wise, right off the bat, they threw away all the conventions of the gore or the macabre and all this kind of stuff, and it's got a Persian carpet rug. It's right in the front,
sure.
And that's it.
And I remember the CD is like blue with like pinkish writing.
It's kind of got a psychedelic feel to it, but then all the music has like a really thrash meets Iron Maiden meets
kind of like dirty Motorhead.
It's almost like
thick and plodding at times.
Yeah, like how AC/DC is to rock, these guys are to extreme death metal. It's a really weird pairing, but I really dig this stuff. It's a little bit sloppy, but it's really catchy, and really pretty dynamic songwriting throughout the album.
And there's this is one of 2 songs that Ceremonial Oath put on the W.A.R. comp, but we're only going to hear this one, so you got to go out and pay hundreds of dollars to seek out the other songs.
I don't think Carpet's quite that expensive. It's tough to find, but
I meant to find the W.A.R. comp to hear.
That'll be hundreds of dollars.
Yeah. I don't know if I don't even know if I know Shadowed End is off of Carpet.
It's on Carpet. New Sun's not.
New Sun's not. So no. We really screwed you over on this deal, didn't we? So the only way you can hear it is off the W.A.R. comp. So. But again, featured members that will end up in Flames, Anders Frieden and then Anders Iwers, I-W-E-R-S. I hope that's the pronunciation.
I'm guessing, yeah, weird.
And they'll show up, I think, Anders will show up on the Jester race, and Iwers will show up, I think, after Horacle, maybe.
He shows up on Clayman.
Clayman, really? Is that late that he shows up? So obviously Frieden and him kept in pretty good contact, and I don't know what he may have done after Ceremonial Oath to stay in the scene,
I think he's been in a couple other groups. I mean, at least like the current drummer, which I don't remember his name.
Daniel is his name.
He was the original Sacrilege
guy, yeah, and he wrote a lot of the early Sacrilege songs as well. So, again, if you're not confused yet, let us keep talking, and you will be massively confused. It's
going to be like soap opera continuity here after a while.
Exactly. Such and such is in a coma, which means that such and such from drum for this band had to be, But so Ceremonial, I've always dug those songs, and you said, you mentioned Iron Maiden as being a primary influence, and if you can get a hold of Carpet, I think one of the more BA tunes on there is the Hallowed Be Thy Name cover. So really, really nifty stuff. Now, more familiar grounds to some of you in the metal world is the next area we're going to move into from the W.A.R. comp, and a couple of different songs from this band Dissection, which as you mentioned before was sort of the Black Death kind of sound. It wasn't straightforward black metal in the way that Mayhem and Emperor and Bathory and
outside of Marduk, they were like one of the few like Swedish black metal bands, but they didn't seem to glom onto all the sensationalism that a lot of the other ones did. He ended up John Neidveit, the singer, guitarist, songwriter, got into some questionable issues later, was in jail.
He was in prison for being accomplice to murder, I think, right? Or he's at the scene of a crime with the
and
guy.
Then he got really kind of spaced out in weird posts.
Rinkos? Is that what you're talking about?
No,
when he got out of prison?
Actually, this is before he got mixed up in the whole thing. I'm going to edit some of this stuff. Okay. Before he got mixed up into the whole crime angle and going to prison, after Storm of Lightsbane, he got wrapped up with, I remember this other guy that was doing this weird synth stuff, and for a while there he was like he did something on Nuclear Blast, which I can't think of what the name of it was, but it was some weird like industrial techno kind of thing.
I do remember that,
and he was like kind of veered off in that direction for a while, and then kind of came back and but I don't think after that point he kind of lost something, because Somberlane and Storm are like 2 of the best records ever.
They're absolute masterpieces of that scene. And really they represent the whole formation of the Swedish Black Death sound, and these are interesting tunes because they're different than anything you heard on the Somber Lane, and it's Where Dead Angels Lie is going to be sort of the standout tune, I think, of Storm of the Light's Bane, because it's so melodic in some ways, and the acoustic intro, and
it sounds really recognizable. I mean, there's something really classic about it, even though it's it's original tune.
And I think weeks ago we picked up on the fact that there's a riff on Fenris from Enslaved's Frost that was very dissection-y in it, and in fact you'll almost hear the exact same riff on Where Dead Angels Lie. Mm-hmm. And there was an old joke, it's not this version, but the version that shows up in the Where Dead Angels Lie EP and the Storm of the Light's Bane full length, where you find a different version of this song where they claim that the scream you hear in the middle is them knifing Dan Swano in the studio and him sort of screeching out loud. Dan Swano, of course, of Edge of Sanity fame, and also production from Unisound Records. And then they also did, we're going to hear their other kind of tune from this record, which was Elisabeth Bathori. Tell us a little bit about that. Their
Tormentor cover. Attila from the only good Mayhem record, in my opinion, De Mysteriis Dom Satanas. This was his previous band, and they really have... I don't know where they fell in with the whole...
I think they were like a Destruction.
Destructionists, had a little bit of Creator edge to them.
But they're Hungarian.
So I can't imagine the scene was too huge there. So they kind of like took all those all their influences, made something pretty interesting out of it, especially for the era it came out. Vocally, it was really interesting too. So,
and of course, Elisabeth Bathori, to those of you who are wise in your history or your occultish metal or anything history, was the Hungarian countess who would sort of sweep the streets of women, prostitutes quite often, and sort of empty their blood into, basically giant bathtubs. And
and Venom did Countess Bathori.
Cradle Filth did an entire concept album about, about her.
The erotic gothness of...
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But it's kind of cool, and, you get to hear John kind of speak in a creepy way at the beginning, where he tells the tale, so... but anyway, so we're going to hear
the blood.
His
best
his Sesame Street impression of the Count here. Yeah, so, but enjoy Where Dead Angels Lie and Elisabeth Bathori on the...
a story about Elisabeth Bathori. Her blood is herself, clean Hungarian blood.
Satisfied.
We just listened to Where Dead Angels Lie and Elisabeth Bathori from the War Comp by Dissection.
Now comes a special treat, I think, for both of us and for a lot of our friends that do listen to this, and hopefully some of you out there that are, avid kind of, free-thinking metalheads. Katatonia, which is, speaking of bands that have developed and gone through a lot of different stages.
Oh, geez, yeah. They've how many genres have they been in? How many styles? It's been all over the place, but they've always had this like great consistency to their songwriting.
Absolutely, and you'll hear it here. This is sort of the beginning of a new direction for them, the first of many new directions, but this is right after they had, of course, done a full-length Dance of December Souls and then the For Funerals Will Come EP. And this is them in the studio kind of recording some songs with Dan Swano, which will end up becoming, some of the basis for Brave Murder Day, which is...
Well, an interesting part, yeah, these two songs were kind of the direction that Swano wanted, as a producer, wanted them to go. And if you read the Decibel Hall of Fame article about Brave Murder Day that our
Fred Chris did
put together, he kind of... Don Swano actually talks about some of his like dismissal of Brave Murder Day, like, well, I'll come in and turn it on and let you guys play, but I don't give a crap about what you're doing.
Yeah, because they want it to be much more kind of abstract and disharmonic in some ways, and sort of
he kind of wanted to follow this weird kind of like goth hybrid direction, which
he was injecting in his own bands with Edge of Sanity, and
he's always had a
Moon
propension
Tower
to that
and
stuff.
some of that kind of stuff.
But I'm definitely glad they kind of stuck to their guns and like, no, I think this is the direction we needed to go.
Sure, but that's another reason why these songs on the War Comp are such an interesting documentary of that style that they were originally going to go into. And the first tune we're going to play is called Black Erotica, but Black Erotica will sound infinitely familiar to some of you who are Brave Murder Day fans because it's later retooled as the song called 12, which is I think the 5th track on Brave Murder Day. But again, it's different enough at first, and it's obviously not Michael singing on this, Michael from Opeth.
It's more the breathy
it's
vocals of
Jonas,
Jonas,
And then Love of the Swan, which, to my knowledge and your knowledge, this is the only place, again, you can find this tune.
Except for that...
the Black Sessions.
Black Sessions, it was like a
compilation.
2 or 3-disc or 2-disc DVD set they put out. I don't know how rare that is anymore, but...
I think it was pretty easy to find, because I think Century Media put it out.
Oh, did they? Where's
Yeah.
it Peaceville?
Good question. I don't know, I'd have to look. But it's
look on Amazon, I'm sure it's around.
Yeah, and it's that's got Saw You Drown EP, that's got a lot of the rare stuff for Funerals to Come. It's actually even got a couple tunes just straight from Brave Murder Day.
Yeah, speaking of rare, the
Saw You Drown EP.
Saw You Drown EP limited to 1,500 copies, and luckily, how many people? 4 or 5 people in our small little town of Mount Pleasant had copies of that.
3, and I was not one of them. Yeah.
Okay. I've had many people ask to buy it off me, and nope, I'm like number 623 out of 1,500 or something. So.
We can do a whole show on rare compilations that Jason Lundy has missed out on.
Yeah.
And I think War Comp and Saw You Drown would top my list, I think. But these, cool tunes. It's just, again, a goth vibe. You almost hear this show up on the Saw You Drown EP with the one more gothy tune that they did on Saw You Drown. Had a real Cure feel to it. Yeah. Which the title escapes me right off the top of my
I can't think
head.
of it right now.
I hate when that happens. But
that's what the internet's for. If we're sparking
exactly.
your interest, go out and definitely check out these subjects.
Yeah, and try and find this War Comp. I'd be curious what it's going for nowadays.
I'm really surprised Regain hasn't reissued it again.
It seems strange. Well, maybe
it probably comes down to licensing rights, I'm sure.
And they'd have to pay off Nuclear Blast, Osmos. I mean, a lot of these songs showed up in so many different labels besides just War, because War only owned Ceremonial Oath.
No, they didn't own Ceremonial Oath.
In Flames and Eucharist, and I think maybe
Purgatorium and Miscreant.
Miscreant, Purgatorium. But the rest of these...
Morning Sign, but which we're going to be kind of glossing over. But it would have... I think it was just like all the stars aligned and everybody was like, yeah, that's cool. You can put that different version on there. That's just like promotion or something.
And no one probably knew that these bands would blow up and become huge of acts,
Yeah, like would have their own Guitar Hero songs. So.
Yeah, exactly. So, but anyways, so enjoy a pairing of obscure, mystical Katatonia songs, Black Erotica and Love of the Swan. Welcome back to our Requiem Metal podcast viewing or listening of the W.A.R. compilation from Wrong Again Records. Just heard the two Katatonia songs that are featured on there, both which are fairly obscure. One will, of course, be retitled 12 on Brave Murder Day, but overall, hopefully the people out there listening to this can sort of see the scope of where this thing was going. It's
looking back at it, 12 plus years later or whatever, it was pretty influential. I think it holds up there with those other signpost kind of compilations, the Metal Massacres, and even the first the In the Eyes of Death comp on Century Media, even though that was purely all their bands, but the level of quality on there was like unreal. There's not a whole lot of those that I can think of past this.
The only other one that sort of I would throw out there is one that is probably even more obscure than W.A.R. compilation, and most people probably haven't even heard of it, is the Projections of the Stained Mind.
That's a really good one too. That was put out on I don't even remember the record label.
Well, I know Mayhem shows up on that, Nirvana 2002, I think Entombed's on there.
You've got House of Usher. You got a bunch of really great stuff on there. Even Skull, a bunch of just random weird bands. Unleashed is on there, Carnage is on there.
Yeah.
That's actually, I don't think it's horribly hard to find, but I think it's fairly expensive.
Is it?
I've got
You have a vinyl
I have
copy.
the LP of it, which I couldn't find the CD, so I think it was ended up recorded off the record on the CD. But that, and also the Peaceville comp that has what was that one called?
You got me on that one. I think I know which one you're talking about. I don't have that one.
It's not Peaceville Volume 3 or Volume 4.
Volume 4 is the one you're thinking of. Yeah.
It had a red cover, and I know I had the view on it, and I don't have it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh, wait, no. Oh, the death metal one.
Death metal.
That's what you're talking about. Yeah.
But that was basically all repurposed Peaceville stuff, from what I can tell.
Yeah, including, the Architects from At the Gates and an early Dissection song from Somberlane. And really, really nifty thing. But, so again, hopefully you can pony up some money. Maybe your friends and you can all chip in a 20 each, and you can hunt down this W.A.R. compilation. But
find it on the BitTorrent sites or something.
Something.
I don't endorse that. I endorse buying CDs.
Exactly. We are promoters of that. So the couple tunes that we didn't play on here are Purgatorium and Morning Sign, a couple bands that really didn't go anywhere in particular that we could find. Purgatorium, I think, had some associations maybe with Naglfar down the road. I
don't know about this incarnation, but I know the guitar player and actually the current vocalist and bass player, or previous bass player, was on that. But
but again,
we had to kind of keep
got to pick our battles.
Sure.
But we hope you've enjoyed all this, and I know we have, because this is just a record that's very special in our hearts and stuff, and in our minds, and we're actually crying right now as we speak. But anyways, if you have any comments, or maybe you're kind of jazzed to hear songs like this that you've never really heard, or maybe you know these bands but have never heard these versions of their songs, please give us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com.
And also check out our website at requiempodcast.com, where you can listen to all of our back episodes, including enhanced versions with pictures and track breaks.
Yeah. Pretty soon maybe we'll have some stickers and t-shirts and
and some business cards.
Yeah, business cards, and maybe I don't know, some magnets and some other kind of fun things for you to collect. Mugs,
coasters,
sets of 4 mugs.
Maybe we'll even bring back the jams.
Oh yes, the color jams. We'll call them the Florida death metal version, circa 1989.
That'd be nice. We'll bring that back.
So be on the lookout for some full-scale merchandising from Requiem Metal Podcast here down the road. So,
but until then, I'm Mark Rudolph.
And I'm Jason Hundy.